Some people have already started. So what I'm doing, what I'd like you to do is on this little note, just listen and write down every single sound that you can hear, each one on a separate page. Exhausted the sound. So now I just like you to look at the sound that you've written down and see whether it's an inner sound or an outer sound. A sound coming from outside or a sound coming from inside. Or just not on the obviously, we're more tuned in to the sounds that are coming in from outside of us. And yet, if you're ever in the situation where you get to really listen, the sound of the blood going through your eardrums and the sound of your own breathing is actually very loud. And we get used to it. We're so tuned to it that it doesn't even really, we don't even notice it anymore. And that's usually the sound that you hear after you finish listening and paid attention to the other sounds. And when I think about Kalaripayat, and what it is about Kalaripayat that allows me to enter into a space that I feel is a creative space, is because it's a form of paying attention to what's going on inside. Now, the sound of what's going on inside is only one of the many qualities, and we are very tuned to perception from the outside, and we think of of perception as being an outward-looking thing. But in fact, the quality of interoception is attention or perception of what's going on inside us. The feeling of being hungry, the feeling of being thirsty, the feeling of needing to go to the bathroom, the feeling of our own heartbeat, which people can learn to recognize, and they can take their own pulse without touching any part of their body. That's a training that you can have, and that's the kind of attention that is inbuilt into Kalaripayat and why I like it so much. So I want this whole thing to be a kind of show, not tell. And so I want to try to show you what it is about Kalaripayat that I love so much, and what it has done to me as an artist, and the kinds of lessons that I've learned from practicing it. So this was the idea that we're somehow not completely in touch with what's going on inside us, and that we can become more aware of it. And one thing that I wanted to kind of point out is that in the language, and I speak English, I don't know whether this is true of other languages, but in English, the body is at the center of so many words that we don't really notice that we're talking about our bodies when we're talking about, for example, understanding. We're standing under something. That's what the word means, and it's a bodily condition that they're talking about. And take a stand. Another thing that we don't normally think of as being a physical act. Take a stand. I'm going to take a stand against something, but it means to stand. And even-handed. To be fair is to hold things equally in either hand. Face up to. You have to face up to something. You come with your face towards it, and it comes out of the closet. Somebody comes out of the closet. It's a purely physical description of something, and the terms have become so embedded in a thinking process rather than in an acting process, in a doing process. So Kalaripayat kind of allows you to get back into the action part of many of these words, how they are actual actions. And when you understand something in coloring, when you undertake something in coloring, it becomes a physical act again. Even though I guess what I'm trying to say is that it was always a physical act, and it's always a physical thing, but this practice makes it more explicit. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to think about, so we've thought about ourselves, to think about the space. And Kalari, the word, actually refers to the space. Kalaripayat is the practice within the Kalari, the fighting technique that takes place within the Kalari. And the Kalari is always just a place of practice. And so that always struck me right from the start, is how, and when you shorten it and how people normally talk about it, is Kalari. And Kalari is that space. And how do you make a space the space of practice? So just before we enter the space, I'd like to show you a couple of images. The body and the space are conceived of in, you can all come and look at this before you do anything else, that in the idea of the temple, the space is on the body. It's in, the temple is a body. It's the divine body. And the macrocosm is the microcosm. In Hinduism, you conceive of a kind of fractal relationship between the part and the whole. The part contains the whole, and the whole is the part. It's an analog of it. And the Kalari is like that. The Kalari is conceived of as a space in which the entrance is at the east, and the Uttara is at the southwest corner, and all the spaces within it are activated, all the corners are activated by energy. Let's not get overly specific, because There are Hindu Kalaris, there are Muslim Kalaris, there are Christian Kalaris, and obviously they conceive of the space not as being Kali in the corner or anything like that, but they conceive of it as being a space at which the energy is activated. So, as the first kind of movement exercise, I would like you to enter that space down there as if you want to make it the space of practice. Now, I'm not going to tell you how that happens. It's not important really, because as I said, in Christian Kalaris, the way of entering the Kalari is different. In Hindu Kalaris, the way of entering the Kalari is different. In Muslim Kalaris, the way of entering the Kalari is different. So we don't have to get tied down to the way they do it or anything like that, way any particular person does it. Just enter the space as if you want to make that space your space of practice.
My space of practice. Don't take it.
Yes. Maybe we can do one thing, which is just to walk around the space, to just move from one corner to the other. Okay. I like to do the salutations as we do it in my Kalari, as my Kalari in Canada. In Kerala, when we go to the Kalari, the space is already set up with the puja corner, the lamps are lit, everybody else is making the circumambulation around to all the corners. But in my Kalari in Canada, we don't have it set up like that. It's a dance studio. Other people use it. It's not used entirely as a Kalari. But the principle of making the space a space of practice remains the same, and therefore my teacher, who often had to work in spaces that were not already set up as Kalaris, started using this as a way to begin and as a way to become a person within a certain space that we're using. So this is the salutation that we use. The left hand goes behind the back. The right hand goes right in between the shoulder blades. And then we all step towards the center of the circle. Take a long step with the right foot. And the hand goes all the way around. Touch the floor. Touch your forehead. Touch your heart. Bring your feet together. And look around at everybody in the room, because we're in this together. And so in my Kalari, we do this at the beginning and the end of every practice. And it's, again, one of the things that I started to love about Kalaripayat. It's incredibly egalitarian. First of all, I come from a tradition, or I have gone to Kalari from Bharatanatyam, which is a much more elitist kind of practice. And in the Kalari, you find yourself in a space with people of all different economic backgrounds and education and jobs, so different kinds of intellectual pursuits. They all pursue Kalari, and there's no distinction made. When you come into the Kalari, you leave aside any part of your personality that's not essential to the Kalari, and you enter the space of the Kalari, and then the practice becomes the most important thing. Now, the I'm going to ask you to do is find a space that I've marked off. And I've marked off rectangles, big squares, and little squares. So stand yourself inside one of those spaces. And some of you might have a very small square, but Sachin, you're not in this space. You have to look and see that the corners are marked. Okay, so there, good. Sachin, poor Sachin. There, nice little square.
Right there.
Or there's a longer space there. Okay, so all of you are in a kind of either a rectangle, a small square, or a very big square, right? Do you see the parameters of your space? Do you know exactly where that is? Now, I want you to think of that space as three-dimensional. Okay, it's a cube. And I want you to try to fill that cube as you like, with whatever shape you want to make, but in some way you should feel like you're filling that cube. Okay, so just take some time to understand where the parameters are and see how you might want to fill. People who are in big squares, remember that it's a three-dimensional space. It's not a two-dimensional space. So you have a lot more work to do to fill it. Yeah, that's right. You have to be able to visualize where it's going above you, not just below you, and not just the footprint of it. And just see whether you can feel the parameters of it. Feel whether you can feel it over your head. And whether you can move the inlet. And whether you can fill it up. So now switch to another space. So if you've been in a long rectangle, switch to some other space. And somebody who's been in a small space, try to take a bigger space.
My is one of the big space.
Yeah, there's lots of rectangles, so I'm sorry about that. But just try to fill it in a different way than however you did it last time. Try to fill it in a different configuration. Okay. So this is all dance is, I think. This is what I understand dance to be: space and the body in space. Time, of course, it's the other thing the other dimension that we have to play with. But this is all there is to dance. And a body moving in space is our medium as dancers. And now what Kalaripayat might add to that vocabulary is because of the way they conceive of the body. And again, I hope that I can show you rather than tell you about this. So now we're going to do a slightly different exercise. Now I volunteer. Somebody who's good. Now, I'm going to do a position, and you're going to look at it for a few minutes, and then you're going to imitate it, and try to get it as exactly right as possible. And then all of you are, she's going to stay in that position, and you're going to imitate her, not me. Okay? So that's the exercise. So, sorry, you don't mind being on the spot, right? This is good. Okay. Stay there. This makes my job a little bit easier. Now you guys are all going to imitate her. Very good. Now, the rest of you stay there. Now, how do you feel? How does this position make you feel?
It's painful.
Okay, stand up. I don't want it to be painful, but I want you to remember that many systems of physical training expect and teach that what you do physically changes. I mean, nowadays they don't even talk about a differentiation between the physical and the mental. The two are so entwined that we can't really even conceive of them as being different. We're always embodied, we're always within our body. But when you get into a position and you start paying attention to where your body is and the signals that your body is sending you, then you're able to be aware of whatever changes that bodily position is affecting on you. So, we're going to try the position again. This is called the lion position from Kalaripayat, and you did a great job. Let's do it again, because she did an amazing job. She really was very good at imitating me, and that's another thing is that we're almost too good at imitating others, especially as children, right? Because the whole thing about being human is this ability to see the world from somebody else's perspective, which is seems to be one of the qualities of being human. And so when you are imitating a bodily position, you're actually seeing how that other person feels in that position, and then trying to get that same feeling in your own body. Does that make sense? Because when you just imitate superficially what's going on with the other body, you're going to miss so much. If you think to yourself, well, the hand has to be here, then you'll get a very superficial feeling. But if you try to understand what that movement feels like to me, to her, and then try to get that feeling, it'll be a different movement. You look skeptical.
No.
Okay, so let's try it again. can name them, you can say, I think it's important. For example, it's super important that the back foot be on the ground. But it's not just because it should be on the ground, because you need that groundedness in order to get the proper feel of the position. You can't get the feel of the position if your heel is off the ground. So there are elements in the movement that are crucial to it being done properly. But we don't need to really even go into that. We can just get that just from our ability to imitate and our ability to copy what is going on and our ability to feel what the other person feels. Okay, let's try again. I'm going to have to come out of the position so I can come and look around at what you guys are doing. Okay, come on. So this position is called lion position. Even though nowhere in the Kalaripayat, where they tell you what you're supposed to do from one sequence to the next, nobody ever calls anything lion position, elephant position, horse position. But this is the story of Kalaripayat, the story that Kalaripayat practitioners and students tell each other about the form. Whether it's based on actual historical events, we have no idea. But they tell each other that the forms are based on the first people who started Kalaripayat watching how animals moved and imitating and taking their stances and their positions from watching animals move and fight. What are the qualities of movement and attack and defense and that you can learn from animals? So, does this give you a different idea of how you would want to do this position? So it's not really important to me whether you're doing the position absolutely perfectly. That's not the point of this interaction. The point is to be able to get the feeling, whatever that elusive thing is, the feeling of what it might be like to do Kalaripayat and what it might be. Now, I think we'll just do it one more time. And this time, knowing what you know about it, maybe you can internalize a little bit more what that blindness of this position is. So, for the last time, Kalari really does do is it maintains a very low position that seems to have some relationship to the way animals move. And no other martial art that I know of has that low position. most other martial arts, even including Indian ones, like Tanda, Manipur, or Silamam, have the person upright. But in Kalaripayat, we're always in this kind of low crouch position where all the internal organs are very well protected by the back, the ribs, the rib cage, the shoulders, and the big bones of the thighs. So I've never seen another martial art form that does this kind of posture, position. Now, before we go on to anything else, do you have any questions, or is there anything that you might be curious about in what I said so far?
Is it like, as you said, it's position of animals, and how space is very important to animals, and is it like to that means animals like lion has its own space,
Yes,
and how it
yes.
their own space
Yes.
is different way it was that space.
Yes.
So the free movement of animals in their own space. So it's like it's the same thing.
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting question, which I have to say I've never thought about it, but I think it makes sense that when you're in the county, you're prepared to move. It's like your territory in a way, like the territory of the lion. He's completely comfortable and knows that space. And it's very similar when you enter the county. You enter it with the confidence and the complete comfort of being in this space where you know that there are no actual enemies. I'm going to come to enemies later. And enemies or opponents, not enemies so much as opponents, are a very important part of Kalaripayat. And so I never would like to gloss over the fact that it's a martial art form in discussing its artistic or its creative applications. That's not what I want to do, or that's not what I'm trying to say. That we can forget about that. But I think in the space of the colony, all those things are a little bit defined and held together. Okay? Are there any other questions?
I'll ask one question which is kind of animal. Like a particular animal trying to mark its territory and being in that territory, kind of defend the territory, etc. It's kind of instinctual thing for an animal. But when a culinary artist is trying to kind of combine various types of movements from, like when you have a lion who is a very ferocious kind of animal, and maybe in the culinary, I don't know, but then you might have various other types of animals with different instinctual natures. You are bringing all these different techniques, instinctual techniques into a compilation within a martial art form.
Yes.
So, and rationality, human rationality becomes an important tool in compiling these things together and to decide which technique to use in which particular situation that the human encounters. So, when you're talking about the confidence of entering the territory, lion enters the territory with a certain confidence instinctually. But when we are one step removed from that instinctual, confidence, you have to build that confidence because you also have a compilation of things which you have to kind of. So how does the practitioner start this? His ultimate aim, I assume, is to arrive at that instinctual confidence.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what's considered mastery. And so the stages of mastery is kind of like that Donald Rumsfeld thing, the things that you know and the things that you don't know, or whatever. But you start off with being conscious of the things that you don't know. And then you start being conscious of the things that you do know. And then you go on to being completely unconscious of the things that you know. So that's kind of like the arc of skill development. And now that you mentioned it, and you have to remember that I never thought of it quite like this before, but now that you mention it, and with your question, you see that as the students come into the college, they come in not quite knowing that the space is there, not quite knowing what they're supposed to do when they get there. And then every time I go back to the college and I see them again, they've moved on to the next level of mastery. So of course it does go slowly. It's not like you walk into the college and you immediately, just because you're in that space, you know that it's a safe space.
The salutation we did and this one, is it like a progression? Like are they connected?
Well, as I said, the salutation in the Kalaris in Kerala, what we usually do is we walk down, and this is kind of cool because this one we walk down steps, and in the Kalaris in Kerala, you always walk down into it. So when I saw this space, it was kind of like, oh, cool, we can do it like that. But you come in, you touch the floor of the Kalari, you go to the corner where the pupila is, you salute the pupila, and then you go to all the corners. And then each corner in my Kalari, which is a Hindu Kalari, there are particular deities in each corner. And at the front is the Guru. And so you bow to the Kali in the corner, the Gurus, and the various deities who I don't know. And each corner has a particular deity, kind of based on that Vastu kind of understanding of space. Some god at a particular corner. And then if the Guru is there, you bow at his feet in a Hindu Kalari. In a Christian Kalari, in a Muslim Kalari, you don't. You go and take the Guru's hand and look into his eyes and just take his blessings, but not in the same way that in the Hindu Kalari where I go and take the blessings from Rabbi's feet. And so, what my Binoy, who's my teacher, one of my first earliest teachers, he was starting to teach in all different places that didn't have a Kalari. So he would have to go and make that space into a Kalari. And this is what we do as dancers as well. Like if we were doing the salutation at the beginning, we're saying this is going to be my space. And what I'm doing is an important and I don't want to say sacred, but it's a practice that I'm involving myself in fully. So to whatever extent I'm going to start and finish with this ritual. So Binoy decided that this was the way that he wanted to salute the space. And so you won't find other Kalaris that they do this. Especially if you go to Kerala and you start like this, people won't know what you're doing. But and each Kalari might have a slightly different approach. While the lion position is one of the basic positions from the movement vocabulary. So it's not really a progression. It's like there are two very different kinds of movement. So what I'd like to do now is to take you through a series of breathing exercises that is part of my Kalari practice. And it's a reminder that the word for breath is the word for taking in a breath is both a physical act and a creative act. When you want inspiration, you inhale, you preparation in your breath. So this is very simple. It's a really simple series of breathing exercises, and it's very good because I'm sure lots of you do yoga or do other kinds of breathing exercises. But one of the things that I really like about this series is that it forces you to do the right thing. While sometimes with yoga, they tell you, inhale and let the breath go into you, and you don't move your shoulders and all kinds of things. This is like the physical act of doing the movement properly forces the breath to come the way that you want the breath to be. So it's a series of 2, 3, 4. We'll do 5 of them. There are many, many breathing exercises in Kalaripayat, and this is one of the things about Kalari, is they don't teach you everything until you need, it's on a need-to-know basis, basically. So when my son, Hans, who also does Kalaripayat, when he injured his back, then all of a sudden the guru taught him a whole bunch of really cool breathing exercises that were specifically aimed at fixing his back problems. And I was like, why didn't you teach me those earlier? But that's how it is. So let's use up the space as much as possible. We need to be not bumping into each other with our arms. So that's great. Good. So the first one is with your feet close together, but not touching. So they're very close together, but they're not actually touching. And as you inhale, take your arms up and go up on your toes. And go all the way until your shoulders pull back. And exhale. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. And then take your feet a little bit wider apart. So they're about the space of 3 fingers, not too far apart, because we're going to keep going. We want to have a little bit of room to go wider and wider. So now hands in front. And as you go up on your toes and inhale, just let your arms and feel that point at which your shoulder blades start coming close to each other in the back. Okay? Inhale, feel your shoulder blades coming together behind you. Exhale. Inhale, feel your shoulder blades. Exhale. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Now, go even further apart. Now this time, you should feel your legs, the bones of your legs come straight down from your hips. You should this is such a easy, relaxed position. Not wide, not narrow, just straight down from your hips. So the way it sits in the hip socket is completely relaxed. The hip socket is in the room that's facing slightly outwards, and the neck is facing, but just very relaxed in the hips. Now, here, in order for it to be the perfect kind of breathing exercise, as I said, you have to pay attention to the body movement. Okay? The body movement is inhale and reach slightly up and back, and then exhale the whole way reaching forward, as if you're trying to touch that opposite wall. until you can't go any further with your hands, then just let them relax and then come beside your ears. If you keep your arms beside your ears as long as you can, then it's almost impossible to do the movement improperly. It's when you let your arms go away from your ears, then who knows what's going on. So you have to keep your arms beside your ears. Okay. So inhale, reach slightly back. Exhale, reach forward towards the opposite wall, keeping your hands beside your ears, beside your ears, beside your ears, beside your ears. Sachin, where are your ears and where are your arms? And then let them go, relaxed. Go behind you, your arms relax now with you. That's right, and back beside your ears, and then come up. Inhale, exhale, reach forward, way forward, arms beside your ears, all the way till you can't go any further, and let your arms relax, go behind you, and come back beside your ears, and inhale. Exhale, reaching way forward. Relax, beside your ears again, and inhale. Exhale. Inhale, beside your ears, okay. And now take a slightly wider position. Now your feet are on the outside of your head, so wider than your head. And this time, inhale and go back, and exhale, the same thing, reaching way forward, keeping your back straight. So this is what you don't want to do. This is what you do want to do. You want to try to keep your back as one straight line, straight through the top of your head, so that you're stretching as if you're feeling the energy still going out through the top of your head, not compressed or the spine getting collapsed at all. Stretching the whole time. So inhale, back, exhale, way forward. Keep the movement forward. And relax your head. Feel it at the end of your spine. Neither arch. I'm just going to go around and just pull everybody's head a little bit. I'm going to demonstrate the Otta sequence. And, you know, obviously it's always done with a partner. So I'm just doing one side of a two-sided process. And I'm doing it with the muchan, which is not the actual weapon. In Kalaripayat, we have wooden weapons, the long stick, the short stick, and the orta, which is a curved stick. And it's especially made for hitting magma points. In Kalari, we have pressure points. I don't know whether they're related in any way to the Chinese pressure points, but they're considered to be places where it's very good to attack when you're fighting, and they're very important in the Kalari massage, which is part of the healing technique. So Kalaripayat is both a healing technique and a fighting technique. So in the Orta sequences, if I had a partner to do it with, you could see that the aim was to the pressure points. So I'm just putting a couple of the sequences together and doing them without the opponent. these are the first 3 of the Orta sequence. Any questions?
Is there a connection with the animal?
Pardon me?
Is there a connection with the animal here?
Yes. The Orta is considered to be the sequence that's based on the movements of the wild pig, the boar. So, beginning with this way of attacking, and you'll see that many of the attacks come from the side, because boars, it seems, I don't know how much of this is true, because I haven't actually observed boars fighting, but they say that that's how they attack from the side.
When you are actually in a fighting situation, how easy is this, like, doing
You're asking somebody who's never been in a fighting situation. So, I mean, this is one thing that I'm going to kind of get to, and maybe I'll get to it right now, because when you think of this as a martial art, as a fighting technique, you realize that right as soon as the Portuguese came with their guns, it was completely obsolete as an actual fighting technique. Anybody with a gun, it doesn't matter how good I am at Kalaripayat, it's not going to help. So why would a practice that we have accounts of the Portuguese coming and seeing this practice, so we know that in the 14th century, in the 16th century, we have accounts of travelers coming and describing a fighting technique that we can presume to be Kalaripayat. So why would people keep on doing it for another 400 years if there wasn't some other usefulness to it? So I guess that's what I'm trying to explore and explain to you, is why do I keep doing this fighting technique that I never have any occasion to fight with? And I'm going to relate it to dance, to Bharatanatyam, and that's a connection that when they teach you any of the techniques, the first one that they teach is the Meipaitu, which is an attack-defense sequence with an imaginary opponent. So why is that imaginary opponent so important? And I'll show you just with the Orta. If you don't have the opponent in mind, then when you do the attack like this, it doesn't really matter where you go. But if you have the opponent in mind, then the attack is going to the imaginary opponent's head. This is one of those magma points that point at the top of your head. So it's very important to keep that being, that person of that imaginary being in mind throughout as you do all the attacks and as you feel the defense. So you're defending your ankle because an attack is coming to your ankle. You're not just going there. Now, why would that be so important in an art practice or in theater or in dance? Well, the connection that I made is that I made it with Bharatanatyam because that happens to be the style that I do. But I'm sure it's similar applicability across traditions. That is, when you are doing a sequence from Bharatanatyam where you say something like, at twilight, at that time, down by the river, I saw you making eyes at her. Who was she? You have to keep that person, that imaginary lover, in mind and create them there, and they have to be real for you so that you can express the right emotion. It's only in relationship to that imaginary other person who you have to see quite clearly in order to express the emotion. In the same way that when you do the Kalaripayat move, the person has to be there for you in order for you to attack and defend the right place. And in Kalaripayat, you practice that. You practice first all by yourself without the opponent, and then with your teacher, with the senior students, with the opponent, and then again without the opponent, constantly switching back and forth until that opponent becomes very, very real and very immediate for you. So I have just one more exercise that I'd like to do with you now. And it's, so when I think of choreography, making dances, and what does it mean to make a dance, to create a dance, I'd like you to get your little, or get a little pad again, and your pencil. So, on this piece of paper, I want you to draw a maximum of 2 lines. And the line that you draw can be any length or configuration, but it must start from one edge and go to any other edge, or even back to the same edge. But it must start from an edge and go back to an edge. And it should be one continuous line. And you can draw 2 of them if you like, but you only need to draw at least one. Draw at least one, but 2 if you really feel.
Straight line?
No, listen to the instruction.
It can be crisscross.
It can be any kind of configuration you like, but it must start from an edge and it must go to an edge, either a different edge or the same edge. It doesn't matter which edge. And it can be straight, it can be curved, it can be crisscrossed, it can be whatever you like, but it has to be one continuous line. Try out a few different ones, and then choose one that you're really happy with. You like that line. Okay, when you've got a line that you're happy with, just come and stick it up on the wall. Just one. Everybody just gets one, so you have to make choices. You have to make a choice. You have to choose the one that you really like. Okay. So, what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to pull out a piece of paper and hold it up, and whoever that is them are quite complicated. It doesn't really matter if you exactly match the drawing that you've done. But
What do you exactly? I didn't get the instructions. What do you do?
so if I hold up this,
Right.
that person who drew this picture is then going to walk like this as if it was this space. It's going to start over there actually, and it's going to go around like this. So obviously there's going to be more than one person walking at a time, right? So when you come to another person, just stop, take a breath, let one of you go by, and just keep going. So I'm going to try to organize it so that there's about 3 or 4 people walking at the same time. Because the space is not huge, but just for you to feel that this is what choreography is. This is just this is how you do choreography. You have an idea, you think, oh, let me try that out. See how it looks in the space. And nothing more than that. Just for me to have fun looking at what you guys are doing, and for you to kind of feel what it feels like to embark on creating a dance. Okay. So I'll start with this. Can't even remember. Okay. Oh my God.
I remember.
Go do it. Watch you do this all day. But choreography is all about just this. The last thing that we're going to do today is in Kalaripayat. I think I told you that, or I don't think I made it clear enough. Massage is one of the very important aspects of Kalari. So not only do you have your practice in the Kalari, in the space that becomes your place of practice through your making it that space. Not only do you try to feel your body, what's going on internally as you do the positions, and feel your sense of being in this three-dimensional space. And not only do you do all those things, and work with an imaginary opponent and a real opponent, both of which are giving you important kinds of feedback to make your positions better. So you're getting feedback both from the way you feel as you do the positions and the way you interact with the imaginary opponent, the way you interact with the real opponent. But you get another kind of very important feedback, and that's through the massage. The massage grounds you in your body. You get a sense of your whole body, where its edges are. Because if you close your eyes, you kind of lose the sense of where your body ends and the outside world begins. You kind of get a sense that, okay, I can feel my skin, I can feel my fingertips. You can hardly feel your face, right? It's like a big empty hole there as you feel. But the coloring makes you feel it. And so, obviously, we can't really don't like other people touching you and you feel very inhibited about that, you can do it for yourself. I think it's nice to relax and feel the other person doing it so that you can just pay attention to that sensation. And then we switch. So if you don't mind, just take a partner and I'll show you what I want you to do. Or if you don't want a partner, just on your own. So I'm going to demonstrate on you because you're my. So the person who's being massaged is just going to close their eyes and feel the sensation on their body. And the other person is just going to do this very lightly. And you're going to start at one shoulder, right? And then go across to the other shoulder. Down the back, across and down the back. And you're not trying to relax muscles or anything like that. You're just trying to give the person the sensation of where those parts of their body are. Right? So you're going to go all the way down, and this all feels really good. So, like the person, you're not hurting them. You're making them feel really good. And down, all the way down to the legs. You can feel, usually you can feel your feet on the floor, right? If you concentrate your sensation, you can feel the feet on the floor. Both legs, down, all the way down to the floor. Then, take one hand and put your fingers in between their fingers and just rotate it like this. And this is the most important point. These are the parts of your body that are hard to feel. Like if you close your eyes, you can't feel in between your fingers. You know, it's really hard to put your attention there. But when somebody touches you there, then you can again feel that part. So the person who's having the thing done, they're just concentrating and feeling all those different parts of their body. And the person who's doing it is trying to be gentle but firm and make sure to get every part of
It doesn't have to be the same movement, does it?
It should be a little this is a good movement. It won't Okay, so now we'll do the salutation again, where we did at the beginning. And a long step forward. Thank you. Now, of course, if you have any questions, you can
Sit down. There's coffee and tea upstairs, so we can move there and have coffee and talk over coffee.
I just want to add this last part, the sensing part of me, I was trying to do Gujiv movements sometime. And
I don't know about that.
Gujiv is a philosophy.
I know.
So movements, there's something called movements, so you have to do sensing.
Oh, okay.
And which is, we took a month only to sense my right feet.
Yes.
So the master was there to just sense it, but he never tried it with someone else
Right.
helping me do it. So I could feel that was so helpful because it's very difficult to sense it. So even when we we'll go back home and we have to keep sensing. Don't forget you have a feet. You have a hand. That is, I guess, one way. And this is something that I could immediately feel this. I actually felt my feet. For me, feet, because that time I couldn't feel it after a month of practicing. So, yeah, it's true.
I have a small question. Actually, not a question.
It's
Actually, what
very
you were asking.
absolutely.
In relation to that, I mean, I have been told by some people in Kerala mainly, they said that, I don't know whether it's true or not, I've just heard. They said that, the kind of movements that you develop and the reflex that you develop, it has very little to do with actually perhaps attacking somebody, but if something happens to you abruptly, you kind of develop a, reflex within like animals. Like they said that, you just go and attack a cat at any moment. It is very difficult to catch them. I mean, I don't know, because I just wanted to kind of ask your opinion about it.
As I said, because I've never been the subject of attack. I've never been in a fight, and I can't speak from experience. But
In one of your articles you mentioned the olden days.
oh yeah. Well, that way, as a guy came by and grabbed my breast as he walked by, and I swung around and hit him with my bag. Really good too. I got him right on the side with a bag full of books.
Oh,
I feel so good. It was the most satisfying.
did you hit a mama point?
But it was a purely reflex action. Like as he walked by, he grabbed my breast and I turned around with my bag and swung and hit it right on the side of the head. Like I'll never forget that. That was my most satisfying moment. But so then, this is the thing. Then he came, instead of being like, oh my God, I did something wrong, I should back off. He attacked me. And then I was petrified. I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And it was on the street near the Nizamuddin mosque. It was in Delhi.
Oh.
And many years ago. But, things like this happen to women to this day. And at that point, when he came, he didn't just, limp off or anything. He was like he was going to attack me. But luckily, because it was on the street, I stood my ground. I didn't back down, but I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have known what to do next. Like that, after that first reflex action. I wasn't going to get into some kind of throw on the ground or anything. I wouldn't have known what to do. Luckily, he didn't actually attack me. So it's true. There is a sense of reflex. But this isn't a Kalari move, particularly with the swinging the bag around. But maybe it's true. Maybe your reflexes are trained. I know the one thing is that I feel incredibly confident in spaces. I don't feel threatened, and I don't feel like I'm in danger when I'm walking down the street. And, people say that keeps, predators have a sense of that. A person who's a predatory male has a sense of whether you feel threatened or whether it's frightening to you. So that's all I can say from the experience.
It could go up and get into hot here, right? There's something that I want to ask. How would you take coloring? Can coloring be taken into a performance space? No, not, I don't mean as a performance of what it is. Thank you so much. Thank you. Can it be taken into the creative space of dance?
The movement of color.
Coloring.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, lots of people are doing that. From Daksha Seth to
Chandralekha.
There's an Artakalari. I mean,
But they are using, they're using it as one of the body, one of the techniques for the body.
They're also just using it. Like Daksha Seth piece has that Otta sequence, like just in the bigger piece. She has this. She's created Ottas out of fiberglass that have a light inside them or something, and the curve of the stick is there. And she just does the whole Otta sequence the way it is. And Chandralekha used the Kalari Banakam as the whole basis of her piece Angika is basically just the Kalari Banakam done by 3 or 4 or 5 people rather than just one. So there are people who use movements from Kalari, and there are people who use actual Kalari sequences. So it has.
But I suppose we were not to transport Kalari out of Kalari, but within Kalari itself, if you were just a Kalari artist, practitioner, would you be able to develop a choreography within Kalari?
Yeah, I mean, all Kalari is choreography anyway.
No, I mean something of your own kind, something that you wanted to do.
Well, I don't understand the difference. Like, what's the difference between what Chandralekha did and
No, what I
Angika?
meant is Kalari has movement and it doesn't have a lot of, it's not like dance form, right? It's like more like it's not a dance form totally developed with footwork and the other thing, range of other things that are part of the dance.
Well, actually,
Vocabulary.
I just don't believe in that distinction. Like, that this is a dance, this is a classical dance, this is a folk dance, this is not a dance. If you intend it to be a performance, then it is a performance. And Kalari is performed all the time. If you look on YouTube, you will see endless versions of the Kalari sequences performed. They're being performed as part of like competition.
Are they all set pieces traditionally done like that, or they are constantly re-choreographed?
They're constantly recording because you want to make it more and more spectacular. It's the same with Bharatanatyam. You want the technique to be more and more virtuosic. It wasn't like that when I started learning Bharatanatyam in 1970. At Vietnam it was about a minute and a half, and now you have Vietnam that go on for 3, 4, 5 minutes, and it becomes more and more virtuosic. And the same with Kalari. They'll start with maybe the Ortha sequence the way I did it, which is pretty simple and very basic moves. And then they'll decide, oh, for this competition, I have to have something much more spectacular. So in the middle, I'll do my splits, or I'll do a high kick, so that it looks more spectacular. And
How many years did you have?
oh, it's more than 40 years. I started in 1970.
The question that she was asking is also something which we would really want to talk about. About performance and these categories that you impose on performance, like your body and your body as a performing body, without seamlessly being there in a space is one thing, and how freely you can access your own body in space is I think a movement that we really want to get into and make possible, because the establishment of dance and martial arts with its rigid, each one has its own rigid frames, then what happens is like, it becomes almost inaccessible for a common person, like, any one of us. Like today, all of us feel that, okay, we can get into the space and define our own space and create our own, define that space with our own bodies. There's a freedom that is coming from that. Like the other thing is the establishment creates a certain kind of frame, and they said this is the way this particular form functions. Then it becomes almost impossible for a layperson to enter that space. So, and then there are so many other discourses, like the discourse of purity, the discourse of, those kind of authenticity, which are around the keeping of the frames in place. So the question that we would really want to explore at LILA, by doing all these things, is to see how you can be responsible. It doesn't mean that anybody can enter the space. Does not mean that you are not responsible about the space. How can each one of us be responsibly engaging with the body and the space around you? Like for instance, there are spaces like when Gitanjali was saying, like when you breathe, do the breathing exercise, there is a space that you give the other. So there is a distance that you give the other to perform, to function. So that those kind of lessons that you learn from this, how do you draw those lessons and let go of the rigid frames? How do you arrive at that ideal is something which we really want to explore with people like Gitanjali.
This is one thing that used to be the case, which is no longer the case, which is that so much of these art forms used to be communal practices, right? And Kalari is still to a very great extent part of the community in which it exists. But when you went to any place, whether it was Scotland or North America, where we did square dancing or step dancing or all the kinds of German dancing where they hit each other and they hit the person next to them, all those kinds of things used to be part of a communal practice, and we used to be immersed in dance. And that is certainly not the case anymore. Now it's really become very specialized, but you have to remember this has happened with everything, it's not just with dance. Music used to be part of a communal practice, like people all used to play musical instruments, everybody used to sing. If you go to Bali now, I think this is the only place where you kind of still see that in effect, where the whole gamelan orchestra is just the people who live in the village. It's not a specialized orchestra where they play those instruments, but the whole village is the dancers and the musicians of the gamelan. So we should, I feel that everybody wants to bring that, like everybody wants to be part of that experience, because it is a wonderful experience to be part of a performance event. It's a very heightened state of being that you get into when you're performing. That's why, like Seema and I, we were addicted to it for so many years, desperate to, because being on stage gave you that heightened sense of being. But at some point you realize that that's a defeating kind of circle, and that you have to expand your idea of what that space is capable of, and bring more to it and bring others into it, and become. That's why I love Kalaripayat, right? Because you get people into it, you're participating together, you're involved in a very close, focused activity. But whether it's I mean, I know that there are many, I've been involved in many experiments too, like where you come together to form some kind of performance or some kind of communal dance event. Now, this is my whole thing, is that anybody can dance, right? Anybody can be part of a dance performance. Anybody can choreograph. Choreography is just what I showed you, you know. Start with something and see whether you like it, and then decide, no, that's not what I want to do, this is what I want to do. But to create something where other people want to sit and watch you, that's a whole different. Am I getting to your point, Lisa, or not?
Yes, but I also want to kind of talk a bit about, I would like what you think about this also, is because there is a whole performance industry which is functioning. It is called, there are a lot of livelihoods around that. You know, there's an industry which is running. So, yeah, and the industry would resist all, any industry would resist openness in terms of anybody can access this. So at the same time, dance is such a beautiful thing that everybody should access it also.
Yeah.
So the question that because you're also, you've come from that history of, you know, doing a performance-based, really performance-based things into this performative kind of space. So I would ask you this question about, like, you know, how do you have this balance? Like, how can you distinguish between somebody who will make a, you know, profession out of, say, dance or any of these forms, and at the same time, there is a possibility that anybody who wants to access it can also access it, without really reducing the, I mean, it should not feel that because everybody can access it, the other person's performance is devalued. You know, you see what I mean? Like,
Yeah. In fact, you know, in continuation to that, like, if you look at a similar form, that is capoeira. You know, capoeira, like, you know, the real performers you hardly meet ever. But you see that, you know, there are fancy capoeira club everywhere around the world. So, like, you know, they kind of broke away from that concept of purity. Like, no, you can't do this because you don't have the training. You know, anybody can just, you know, stand together in a field and can practice capoeira. Like, you know, do you see such possibilities with Kaleri, like, as a form, like, where we can take it to, like, you know, the way we did today, where it is, like, you know, we are not going to have perhaps even the actual notion ever, but we still have an initiation. So where we feel that we are part of it, and
you know, I'm also, because as an organization, our concern is to actually create a via media as to, you know, because we really do not want to let go of the history of training and, you know, wisdom and knowledge, which is there in many of these fields, you know, because we want to really respect that. And dismissal is a kind of, these days it's become a kind of keyword. Okay, these are all very, you know, anybody can do it. So we don't want to go into that, we want to resist that on the one side. And really respect history. But at the same time, we understand the dangers of history and these rigid structures. So the endeavor is actually to create a middle space where, you know, respect is given to spaces. But and you have to draw from those spaces because everybody cannot rigorously practice that.
Yeah.
So but at the same time, there is a need to make some lessons accessible because it is a universal legacy. You know, that's something which everybody should access, the beauty of it.
Right.
Yeah. So how do you create that middle path is what we are trying today here.
Right.
So you need to create forums like this which will not lighten or, you know, trivialize the the training. But at the same time, openness, that like you were talking about your son's case, and suddenly, even after so many years of practice, suddenly he realized that there were certain things which he didn't know.
Right.
And it needed to be taught only at a certain point. So it was not needed. But at the same time, he was actually, he had access to all the beauties of Kalari.
Right.
So there has to be some way of, making it accessible.
Also, you mentioned that Kalari, you met all sorts of people from all communities, all class. And is it more flexible than Bharatanatyam in that sense? Maybe how tight a structure it is. That comment that you made, that
Yeah, so when I first went to the Kalari in Kerala, the very first time, which was probably in 1985 or 86, that's the first time I'd ever seen Kalari, and I went to Kerala to see how it was practiced. And I walked into the Kalari, and there were all these men wearing just the little langoti, and girls as well. Right from the start, I've never seen a Kalari that didn't have girls in it as well. Girls, not grown women. It still seems to be a kind of thing that women stop when they get married. They don't continue. Though some, I mean, I've heard of these Kalaris where it's women-only Kalaris and stuff like that. So I've heard about it. And there was in the news a woman who's in her 70s doing Kalari. So I'm sure there is, but for example, in my Kalari, Kavita, who is Gurukhal's daughter, who's very, very good, when I first went there, in the meantime, has got married and doesn't practice anymore. Every once in a while she still performs, but she's nowhere near as good as she used to be because she doesn't keep up the practice. But just to go back to that moment when I walked into the Kalari, I saw all these men in their young men, young boys and men and young girls in the Kalari wearing just the langoti, all covered in oil. And then when the Kalari was over, I saw them get into their bus conductor uniforms. You know, they were, a couple of them were bus conductors. And I've never had a social interaction in the many, many years that I've lived in India. It's not a social interaction that I would have, but when I went to practice in these Kalari, they were teaching me things, they were showing me how to do the moves better. And I didn't know until we went out that they were who they were or what they were, and that's how the Kalari is supposed to be. It's supposed to be organized as a completely neutral space that everybody drops their ideas of who they are or what they are and comes into the Kalari and practices for that time. So it was a big eye-opening experience for me because I just come from Bharatanatyam, which is not like that at all. You know exactly who the person was. She gets dropped in the car by her driver and she comes to the class and her mother is there and takes her back. And that whole kind of very South Indian middle class and upper middle class attitude was completely missing in the Kalari, whether it was male or female or whatever. The girls were amazing. They were practicing it.
Is that only in Kalari or is that also in Kudiyattam and other Kerala arts? Is that something to do with Kerala and Tamil Nadu? Or is it something to do with
I think it's a function of the social movements as well, isn't it? Because I don't think Kalaripayat was always open egalitarian. It would have been the preserve of the warrior caste, right?
And the women, because one of the most famous of the Kalari warriors is a woman, Uniyakcha, who was famous for defeating somebody who attacked her just by glinting the blade. She never even actually touched him or touched his blade. She just flashed the blade like this so that his eyes were, he was blinded by it. So she's considered to be like one of the very things. So the idea that women were doing Kalaripayat as part of the tradition is old. It's not a recent phenomenon, unless they just made up the story recently. I don't know. But the women Kalaripayat practitioners and the urmi, the urmi, the flexible sword, is considered to be a penultimate woman's weapon because you can wear it as a belt. Nobody needs to know that you have a weapon. You can just wear it as a belt and then just pull it out and whip it.
Like a bag was pulled out.
So I don't think it's a recent. I don't think it's
No, but I'm curious to know, is it only in the Kalaripayat, or is it across Kerala in the other art forms as well? Or do you think it's this, suppose in Kathakali or Kuriyatam or the other Nangas, would it, the hierarchy would be apart? It would be still be there, right? Whether it's Brahminical thing or not Brahminical thing and all of that.
Kathakali is certainly there, but in Theyyam it's there. Men do Theyyam and women don't do Theyyam, as far as I know.
There's
And-
one Theyyam which is a woman Theyyam, that's only Theyyam.
But the Theyyam is one of those things that only those they will practice. They will not practice. Very caste.
It's a caste-based.
Caste-based thing.
Yeah.
Even Putta also, mostly practiced only by, now, and for other things you practice, but it's traditionally practiced only by caste.
Gitanjali, as
So it's only in Kalari, sorry. So that's really phenomenal, It's only in Kalari you have this. It's really incredible how democratic the whole setup is.
Yeah, I hope that I'm not
Yeah,
idealizing.
I met bus conductors more than the women. Like
Yeah.
we're talking about the classes.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. It would perhaps not always been the preserve. I think it was the preserve of the warrior caste. I'm presuming. I'm asking whether you could perhaps know when it opened up. That was a function of the Temple Entry Act and people.
Oh, okay. I see
Yeah.
what you mean. Sorry, I misunderstood. I thought you were asking about the women. But I do think that when at the time of Indian independence, the idea that things were not hereditary practices came into being as an intellectual idea, that you could be a dancer whether you were born into the Devadasi community or not. You could be a Kali practitioner whether you were born into that hereditary family or not. And you could be any of the number of things that used to be hereditary until Indian independence. It was all of them. Odissi was the domain of the Gotapuas, Bharatanatyam was the domain of the Devadasis, Kalaripayat was the domain of the Nayars or whatever caste. But when C.V. Narayanaswamy came on the picture, it was part of that whole movement to make things, he got people together. Now, you used to be that you practiced Kalari, and you never told anybody else what you were doing in your Kalari. You had to come and join that Kalari to find out. But C.V. Narayanaswamy got Gurukulas to come together and to talk about their practice and to kind of unify it into one practice. And so you see all over Kerala, CVN Kalaris. And that was part of his kind of democratizing energy that he put into it. As I understand it now, as I have to say, there is so much research that needs to be done into various aspects. So this is Gopala Narayanaswamy was teaching in Madras, one of his sons. And so this is the story that he told, that his father got all the people together and asked them to share their secrets, which up until then were secrets, that, I'm only doing it in my Kalari. You can come and learn with me for 20 years and then I'll share it with you. And he put it together into a form, very much like what Rukmini Devi did with Bharatanatyam and what happened in Odissi and what happened in Kathak. So it was happening in India all at the same time. People were thinking in the same way about what to do with the art form.
Was this in the 1930s also?
Yeah.
So the 30s were the time when all these things were happening.
Yeah, it was actually a little bit more in the 1940s, I think. But, and the freedom of that was that it's so amazing. They didn't think about authenticity. Authenticity was not a concept that was important then. So you'll see that in one of the later sword and shield sequences, or the early sword and shield sequences, they have movements from fencing. Because Nehru used to fence, taught people in India who went to the good schools used to fence, so they put some fencing moves in. Because it's a sword and this is a sword, and why can't we do it like that? And then, so, I mean, I would never have known until Hunt said, my son, who fenced before he started to do Kalari, he said, this is a fencing move. And then there's a picture of Nehru with his fencing move like this. And then all of a sudden, like, I don't know why anybody would think that this is good, is that you take your shield and hold it like a, and do these fencing.
So, but say at Gurukul, at Calicut, have you ever spoken to him about what might have been the kind of students who practiced Kalari when he was a child?
No, I never have. I mean, that's true. I should do
Because
that.
maybe, because now what happens in the Kalari is that everybody comes, little kids, and from all classes and all age groups. They just come in the morning, they do their Kalari. It's like part of a routine, part of their daily routine. Before going to school or before going for work, they could come to the Kalari, oil themselves, do the Kalari, go back home, have a bath and go. You mean to say this was not there before?
That it wasn't this kind
This
of...
kind of thing was not there before, and they only taught a few people who were just dedicated to the color and were just like what they call, dedicated to the guru and not.
You're talking about before the 1940s.
When Gurukul was learning from his father, after pre-independence.
Yeah.
At least that much he would remember.
Yeah, I should definitely talk to him about it. But I mean, that's the story, that before C.V. Narayanaswamy came along, people practiced Kalari in their Kalari with their hereditary family members. They never showed it to anybody outside. First of all, it was illegal. It was one of the practices that the British had outlawed. So you weren't allowed to practice Kalari. So you kept it within your family, and then he decided that, look, this is something, I mean, the whole idea that Indian art forms were valuable and should be taught and disseminated came along at the time of Indian independence. Up until then, it wasn't considered an important thing. And so...
Isn't there a difference between what happened in Bharatanatyam in 1930, where, you use like the critiques on that particular type of nationalization of Bharatanatyam in the 1930s, you have a very sensuous kind of art, dance form, which is made into a certain kind of rigid form. Like when you actually practice it, look at a Bharatanatyam dancer who really does not move her body the way one can really move. Like, you feel as though it's a rigid form. So, but which is different from, as far as research goes, from the Sadir dance, which is a very sensual kind of dance. So when the implications of this is, and also when you make this chaste dance of Bharatanatyam, you are also saying that this is a 3,000, you call it Bharatanatyam, and say that this is a 3,000-year-old form. So then,
the same kind of thing goes on in Kalaripayat.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Kalaripayat is tied, they say, oh yeah, it's back to the Vedas. There is a Veda called Danu Veda, which is supposed to be about Kalaripayat. It isn't. It has nothing to do with Kalaripayat, but Kalaripayat ties itself back to that.
Yes.
That kind of authenticity through text and ancient text is part of this movement. Yeah, it's part of what went on in the 1940s. Now, the thing that is different about Bharatanatyam and Kalaripayat is the sex. There was no sex involved in Kalaripayat, and the idea of the performer, up until then, more or less, the female performer was always religiously sanctioned, erotically available woman. It was never before. It was Rukmini Devi who said, "You can be a dancer without being sexually available to men." And it was a very important thing. It's not something that you can just brush aside and call, oh well, she was appropriating the dance form or whatever. She was making a very important, she was creating a very important category that we value to this day, the category of an artist. And an artist is not necessarily sexually available. And up until then, a performer, any kind of female performer, whether it was in the Tavais, in the Mudra, in the Devadasis of the temple in Puri, whether it was the Devadasis they might have been great artists, they had to be sexually available to men. This was not a good thing, and this is not a thing that I would want to be part of. And so to say, oh, well, the dance was made more chaste, it was. But then now all of a sudden it wasn't about attracting a male patron. And so obviously it had to change, you know. You can't keep on doing those same dances for a mixed audience. You can't keep on doing, I mean, it's so frustrating to me that this has come down and it's tied to this very simplistic narrative of chaste versus sensual.
I guess the idea of the way we understood eroticism before 19th century was way different than we understood it post 19th century.
Yeah.
Because the idea of, I was reading a lot on Apsaras, and the idea of eroticism could be therapeutic, the idea of eroticism could be a way to nirvana, the idea of eroticism could be a lot more than what we started understanding of it post 19th century, and thus the need to refine it, because now everyone understands eroticism in a very different fashion altogether. Like, it was never, the interpretation we have of eroticism now never existed.
Exactly.
Like that.
The ideas of eroticism were different. The ideas of what a female body was different. The idea of what possibilities for having a profession. The Devadasi was entirely based on patronage. And now it's still based on patronage, but now it's the state. And at least you don't have to sleep with the state, at least most of the time.
You have a choice.
You have a choice.
You have a choice.
But, it's not entirely fair either. We just have to understand the narrative in a bit more of its complexity. Because we have a choice. We have a choice because we're middle-class women. We don't have a choice because, I have a choice because I don't really have to earn a living as a dancer. If I did, I would be earning a very poor living. I would be living in a hovel somewhere if I had to live entirely on what I make as a dancer. And so that's why we have a choice. But it's a valuable choice, and we shouldn't kind of frown over it or dismiss how important it is. And those women who were, no matter how great artists they were, and many of them were great artists, and it's from them that we have our art form, they didn't have that choice. They couldn't decide, oh well, I want to be a dancer, but I don't really want to sleep with this guy. And they didn't have that choice from a very young age, which I don't care how sexy the dancing was then. I'm much happier with the less sexy dancing, and no young girls having their virginity sold. These are choices that we make, and you can't really put the art form above the human beings who did it, or the needs of the art form, or what you think of. Like my father didn't want me to be a dancer, and he told me this is what Devadasis do. He told me about going to a performance where it was all men, and while doing the padam, the woman pretended to lose her nose ring, and then she would just kind of rub the laps of the men, pretending to search for the nose ring. And that's when my father, telling me this in the 1970s to dissuade me from being a dancer. And this is the kind of thing that dancers do. This is what it means to be a dancer. The idea that a dancer could be a woman who just danced was simply non-existent in India.
So I think, like she said, eroticism and sexuality is one thing, and making yourself available on those grounds is a completely other thing. So what happened with Rukmini Devi and that whole movement was that they cleaned out Bharatanatyam. In a sense, certain poses were removed altogether. And there's this movie called The River by John Renoir, where you see one of Rukmini Devi's students, she plays the role, she has a sequence where she dances. And it's really so rigid when you compare it to Shobana, who is, I don't know what her name is, Shobana. When she's very free about using sexual movements and being sensual. And I feel that brings back, I mean, as someone who's watching as a complete outsider, it brings back a bit of what it used to be, rather than this really cleaned up clinical performance of Bharatanatyam that I associate with the Rukmini Devi thing.
It's really unfair though. It's a really unfair kind of comparison. Because the person who danced in the river was not Rukmini Devi's student, and it's actually wrong to think of anybody as Rukmini Devi's student. Rukmini Devi didn't really teach dancing. She brought Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai to Kalakshetra to teach dancing. Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai is the same teacher who taught everybody else. She had Gauri Amma, who was the Devadasi of the Mylapore temple. At Kalakshetra, all the early students of Kalakshetra were taught by these people. Chokalingam Pillai, Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai, Gauri Amma. So they had the training, the same training as everybody else. And if you look at old footage of the Alaripur from the one that I showed that day, the Baroda Devadasis of the Maharaja of Baroda dancing for some royalty who'd come. It looks just like the Alaripur of today, except not as refined. They weren't really concerned with keeping their hands here. But the Alaripur is exactly the same. It's the same. It's exactly the Tirmanam that everybody does to this day. So the idea that there's one very cleaned up version of Bharatanatyam and one very sensuous version of Bharatanatyam that's been lost and is being regained is there were so many versions of Bharatanatyam. So many. There were so many versions of the dance form that has now come to be known as Bharatanatyam because it was called Sadir. It was also called Bharatanatyam. The latest book of Davesh Sonaji points out that it was called Bharatanatyam 100 years before Rukmini Devi and they came along. So the idea that this name and making it Sanskritized all came with.
But even if, excuse me, I feel, Gita, now that I've been listening to you on this topic, it's so valid. Even if it did, you know, the kind of context and the time that we live in is important.
Yeah.
Maybe you go to the other extreme because you want to bring it out, you want to popularize it, you want it to become acceptable.
Yeah.
So history brought that is where history brought Rukmani Devi to, and she needed to do that precisely to make it available to anybody, any women or any male who wanted to take it up as a dance without being an object of sexual desire. You know. So at that point,
Because we had suddenly this 19th century idea, the colonial idea, that this is so bad, the nude is suddenly bad. We never had that understanding post 19th century. And so, I guess same with eroticism. Now if such a thing is existing, you can't really, it's impossible to help people do Bharatnatyam if that idea still exists. That it's sensuous.
But you're talking about different, sorry, what Gita is trying to say was that the people who were doing Bharatnatyam at that time, who had the dance form with them, were all women who were exploited. They, at the age of 11 or 12, their virginity was sold to the aristocracy
So to think of this as
or the priests.
eroticism or sensuality or anything like that, it's not something we want to do.
See, they were basically prostitute. They were forced into prostitution of a selective kind, and their
High-class
mother.
man, a long-term relationship, not going and being prostituted.
And once this fellow they fell out of favor with this guy, they had to find some other fellow to lure so they could survive some more time, you know. It was a very pathetic condition.
The question of choice is.
Yeah, the question of choice is important.
Choice. But you know, maybe we can think about one thing, Geeta and Sima, like the question of choice and the actual feminist endeavor to really, take a strong stance and say that, see, this is no longer done. We should be able to access dance without being, there is no need to be branded as this or that, but anybody can access this, anybody can go and learn this. That was, I think, very strong historical statement and movement that was needed. The other issue, the thing that Kanupriya is bringing out is also a kind of narrative which is really overlooking the question of real choice during that time itself. Like, when we say there is a kind of eroticism which is different from the post-colonial or colonial understanding of eroticism, we don't know how the women actually lived. They looked beautiful, much more beautiful and more sensual and sexier than, and even actually it's more beautiful than what we see today. And to imagine retrospectively that that eroticism was a much better eroticism is actually another kind of narrative. And it's also a trap. So what we really need to do is, like, perhaps while at that historical point of 1930s, this was actually needed to make this kind of a statement. And I think in all the art forms, we needed this nationalist movement and say that, see, we have a position. Because it's also like we are fighting against somebody and say that, we have a nation, you don't have to give the nation to us, we already have a nation and we are asserting it, etc. All these things I think was historically important. But I think so many years hence, today, when we look at this, I think we should not fall into both these traps.
No,
because
exactly.
it's a different movement that we need today, which, as Agnes was saying, I don't know, I wouldn't comment on Shobana, but maybe like one or two people who are there, like who's got some grace in doing, rediscovering their own bodies even as they stay within Bharatanatyam. Actually are showing a way of perhaps reclaiming their bodies without being sexual slaves,
Yeah.
So there is a possibility of doing it, and that is the historical thing that we have to do now. Neither this nor that.
Yes.
So we need a new movement of Bharatanatyam without letting go of Bharatanatyam's
Bharatanatyam is a wonderful, amazing,
Absolutely.
rich, vibrant, and very open to infinite possibilities for working with in very modern, contemporary ways. The fact that very few people are doing it, Seema is one of them, she's doing still. I no longer dance, but I see the potential for it very, very vividly. And I think it is true that one of the big problems is simply the categorization, deciding that this is Bharatanatyam, this is not Bharatanatyam. This is classical, this is folk, this is martial arts, this is performance. The categories are very fluid, and they're constantly intersecting and interacting, and we don't really need we don't need to have the category. The category is not being helpful anymore.
It was helpful maybe at some point, but we have to let go of, maybe create new categories at this point. Maybe there are some categories which we have to create which are relevant today, but we need real interrogation to understand what those categories are. They are completely new categories which have completely different formats. Like for instance, the format that we are creating today is a different format. It has such. You have to push the limits of format in order to arrive at new formats and new categories.
I mean, people are very sick and tired of going into a theater and sitting down and passively watching what goes on in the stage in front of you. That's very well documented, whether it's ballet or the classical orchestra or Bharatanatyam. Nobody really wants to do that anymore. And so to create work that engages an audience, any form is available to that, but it really does require figuring out how are you going to work with it? How are you going to work with your audience? How are you going to engage people in what you're doing?
This critique of dance that you have, how do you teach that to your students at a study? Do you teach? Are you working on transferring it?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I taught a dance history course in which I explored it was called Dance and National Identity. So it's really tied up with it, but it was almost impossible. I'm telling you, after talking to them for half the semester, they were still saying, oh, but this is so spiritual, and this is so 2,000 years old, and this is the Natya Shastra, and this is, but my dance form comes from the Natya Shastra, whether it's Bharatanatyam or Odissi or whatever, Kathakali, because they all have the same story. So it's like, no, yeah, that's okay for you. You can say that, but that's not true for my dance form. My guru told me that it comes from the Natya Shastra. So it was really almost impossible to get them to stop talking like that and to look at it. I mean, Nina Oldenburg's essay about the Tavaifs of Lucknow, they read that, and they still came up with this story about Kathak being from the Kathakas of the Vedas or whatever. And I say, look, didn't you read this in this
Yeah, about Kalaripayat. What is the philosophical orientation of Kalaripayat exactly? I mean, is it resting on a philosophy, like some axis that you have to explain to students first? Because from the little that I know among friends who have gone into martial arts, and I did very sketchily at some point, is that they explain a philosophy this is what you do, this should be your stance, this is your guru, and this is this is how your approach to life should be. Is there something like that in Kalaripayat?
Yeah, there is. I tried to kind of give you an idea of what those elements are, the elements that make up that philosophy. The Kalari is that space of practice, that you have a space of practice. So that's very essential to Kalaripayat, that you have a space of practice, that the people who enter that space of practice are your compatriots, and you move with them and among them. That the Guru he's going to teach you as you deserve to know. There's no system of belts or anything like that. When he thinks you're ready for the next thing, he'll teach you. You don't go and tell him, well, I want to learn this, I want to learn that. You kind of wait for him to express that you're ready to move on. That this idea of the body as a really integrated system where you have to pay attention to everything that's going on inside as well as outside, and that it cultivates very, very explicitly that peripheral awareness of what's going on in the space all around you, and your relationship to the space all around you. And then it makes some other concerns more explicit, like the idea of non-points, that there are energy systems in our body. That it's you never attack. Your master only teaches you how to do various techniques when he's sure that you're not going to use them badly. So he's very restrained about teaching the highest form of Kalaripayat only to people that he's very convinced that won't misuse it. The idea in Kalari is there that you can kill somebody by pressing the pressure point, and that you should give that knowledge to just anybody. And that philosophy is not explicitly outlined in any kind of text like it is in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, right? Where yoga has that kind of thing. Kalaripayat doesn't have it all written down, so it kind of depends on each person's view, what they tell them, and what they explain to them. My teacher doesn't talk much. First of all, we have a language problem. He speaks Malayalam, I don't speak Malayalam very well. But I think he's just like that. He's not a person who's going to tell you all the details.
So what if that is meant to migrate into your worldview?
Well, I do think they expect it to be a long, ongoing process. So over 6 years, you're going to understand what Kalaripayat is all about. And I think that's really what they're expecting, that you spend 6 or 7 years doing it. So you start as a student where you're a little kid and you just do whatever you're told. But by the time you start at 12, by the time you're 18, I do think they expect a certain kind of human being to come out of that color, with a certain kind of attitude towards their bodies and to the world outside. And it's a very responsible, very self-aware kind of being that they want to create.
The alertness part, I felt it very strongly when we did the first course. Not really then, but when you told me that it's the lion pose, suddenly there was some sort of alertness that suddenly came. And for to say the mind-body coordination, I could feel that. There was just one point. After that, I couldn't get it. But the moment you said it's the lion pose, I could.
It felt like a lion.
I felt alert.
Yeah.
I don't know. And then suddenly I could feel my backbone taking a certain position on its own, because my mind, I could see how I've been trying to study how mind controls the body and how can you really, how can you track it down, which is very difficult. So I could see when my mind knew that it's the lion pose, and the message went, and suddenly my body was taking shape, and I could really, I was looking for a break. So yeah.
So anybody was your prey today?
Yeah, actually I was looking at the wall. Basically.
No. I should get, I have to go all the way back to the drivers.
Because, okay, we're staying with it. I'm going to Noida.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm not very far and I'm planning to take it accommodation. And I wanted to, the question that he said that how are you teaching it to your students?
Okay, sorry. So I'm trying to teach principles of Kalaripayat as well as a practical Kalaripayat. So my students are not dance students, right? They're engineering, mainly engineering. A lot of students who take other disciplines. So my class, they have no idea. They might have had Bharatanatyam training from childhood, without much understanding either, you know, just being told BFA, whatever. And they've come to a certain level. They might have trained in Kathak in a similar way. The three forms that I've encountered are Bharatanatyam, Kathak, and Odissi. So they've had some basic training, some of them. And a lot of them are boys because they like the idea of doing martial art. So I have practical training in Kalari, as well as training on the principles that you could draw out from Kalari that might be useful no matter what you did in life. Because I know that they're not going to be dancers. So there's no point training them to be wonderful dancers. So that's what I try to do, so that we've got kids who are really focused on the Kalari part, and they're doing Kalari extremely well. They've been like awesome. I'm going to take some of them to meet my guru in Kerala in July. He's going to be so thrilled. And then there are other people who are just not that interested in the Kalari, but they're interested in what the possibilities are of working with energy in this way, the introspective way. You can apply all this to whatever form you do, right? So it's a practice of being alive to the interoception of your body. And so we work that way because I'm really trying to create a physical practice that is not tied to any particular form. That you can do it and become a better Bharatanatyam dancer, you can do it and become a better Odissi dancer. I don't know if it's possible, I just think that it must be, that you can, there are things across those art forms that would be good for anybody to do, and they'd be better at it if they did. So that's my classes like that. And, it's a lot of fun. The students have a great time. So, yeah. Thank you all so much.
I feel cutting is at the
If you
very
have
dry.
clicked on, like, for example, my photograph and someone else's as well.
For
On that page, when I click on the